Felix Grayson had built his restaurant chain from nothing, just a small burger joint with a grill, a dream and long nights spent perfecting every detail. Now, 6 locations thrived across the state, but something felt off. Complaints had been trickling in: bad service, rude employees, food quality slipping. He'd heard it all before, but this time something gnawed at him. "I don't get it," Felix muttered to his wife, leaning against their kitchen counter late at night. "I built this place on good food and great service. How does that just disappear?" She gave him a knowing look. "You're too far from it now, Felix. You gotta see it for yourself." That was how he found himself dressing in worn-out jeans, an old hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He'd grown the business, but most employees had never met him in person, just a name on emails and company memos. That worked to his advantage now. He planned to visit all 6 locations over the next few weeks. No heads up, no warnings, just walk in as a customer and see what was really happening. The first 2 locations weren't great, but nothing catastrophic. Some slow service, a few disinterested workers, and one manager more focused on his phone than his staff. Felix made mental notes. Then he walked into the 3rd restaurant. The place had a worn-down feel, like no one cared. Grease stains on the counter, napkins scattered near the soda machine. Employees barely looked at customers, moving sluggishly through their tasks. He stepped in line behind a woman holding a toddler on her hip. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her long brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail. The little girl, maybe 3 years old, clung to her shoulder, rubbing her eyes. When she reached the counter, she fumbled in her purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Just a kid's meal, please," she said, her voice weary. The cashier, a young guy who looked barely out of high school, nodded and punched in the order. But before he could say anything, a sharp voice cut in. "Ma'am, you're holding up the line." Felix turned his head. A man in his 40s, wearing a manager's badge, stood with his arms crossed. His name tag read Todd. The woman looked startled. "You're digging through your purse for pennies," Todd said, his voice rising. "We don't have time for that. Either pay or move aside." Felix felt his jaw tighten. The woman's face flushed. She hastily grabbed a few coins from her pocket, her hands shaking. I think this should be enough." Todd snatched the coins off the counter, sighing loudly. "Unbelievable." The little girl whimpered, sensing her mother's distress. Felix had seen enough. "Hey," he said, stepping forward. "That how you talk to customers?" Todd barely glanced at him. "Mind your business, buddy." Felix's voice was calm but firm. "She's a paying customer. There's no reason to talk to her like that." Todd scoffed. "Oh, so now we got heroes in here." "Look, we're short-staffed and I don't have time for people wasting it. If she can't afford a meal, that's not my problem." Felix's hands clenched at his sides. He took a breath, forcing himself to stay composed. The woman grabbed the meal and murmured a soft thank you before hurrying away, but Felix wasn't letting this slide. He turned back to Todd. "So you think treating people like garbage is part of the job?" Todd rolled his eyes. "You don't know how it is. These people come in expecting handouts, wasting our time. I run this place. If you don't like it, go somewhere else." Felix stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "All right," he said. "Guess I will." Because soon this wasn't going to be Todd's restaurant anymore. Felix walked out of the restaurant, but only to his car. He had no intention of leaving things as they were. Sitting behind the wheel, he rested his hands on the steering wheel, thinking. Everything about that interaction was wrong. The tone, the impatience, the way Todd had humiliated a struggling mother in front of customers and employees alike. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he needed. A few rings later, a familiar voice answered. "Felix, what's up?" It was Mark, the district manager overseeing all 6 locations. "Got a question for you," Felix said, leaning back in his seat. "Who's in charge of the 3rd location?" There was a pause. "That'd be Todd." "Why?" Felix exhaled through his nose. "How long's he been running that store?" "About a year. Numbers have been steady, but I've had a few complaints about his attitude. Nothing major, though." Felix's grip tightened. You sure about that? Mark hesitated. I mean, I've heard he's strict, runs a tight ship. Felix shook his head. Not strict, disrespectful. You ever seen him interact with customers? No, but then you don't know, Felix interrupted. I just watched him humiliate a mother in front of her kid because she was a few seconds slow pulling out change, spoke to her like she was beneath him. Mark was silent for a moment. That doesn't sound good. It's not, Felix said. I need you to head over there now. I'm going back inside and I want you to listen when I call you again. Mark didn't argue. I'm on my way. Felix ended the call and stepped back into the restaurant. Todd was near the register, giving orders to a cashier who barely looked at him. The employees seemed tense, moving through their tasks with little enthusiasm. Felix walked to an empty table near the counter, sat down and watched. Todd's voice carried across the room. Move faster, people. Lunch rush is coming and I don't want to see anyone dragging their feet. A young woman at the fry station flinched as she reached for a fresh batch. Felix studied Todd's body language. He wasn't just strict, he was domineering. His words weren't encouraging, they were sharp, condescending. The employees weren't motivated, they were afraid of making a mistake. A man in his early 20s approached the counter with a hesitant expression. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and he looked nervous as he cleared his throat. Hey, Todd, I need next Saturday off. My sister's graduation, Todd cut him off. Not my problem, you know how this works, you request time off a month in advance. I did, the employee said quickly. I sent it weeks ago, Todd scoffed, and we're short-staffed, you're needed here. The young man's face fell. But you want to keep your job, Todd snapped. Then be here. Felix pulled out his phone and dialed Mark. When Mark answered, Felix spoke quietly. You listening? Yeah, Mark said. I just walked in, I see him. Good, Felix said. I need you to watch him for 10 minutes. Just stand back and see how he treats people. Mark didn't question it. Felix ended the call and waited. Within minutes, it was clear Todd's behavior wasn't a one-time thing. He spoke to employees like they were disposable. Every interaction carried impatience. He barked orders, dismissed concerns, and made it clear he held all the power. Felix had seen enough. He stood, walked to the counter, and locked eyes with Todd. Todd barely looked at him. You need something? Felix's voice was steady. Yeah, we need to talk. Todd crossed his arms. About what? Felix pulled off his baseball cap and let the moment settle. The cashier nearest to them gasped softly. A few employees stopped what they were doing. Todd's face twitched with confusion, then realization. His posture stiffened. Felix let the silence stretch before speaking. I own this place. Todd's mouth opened slightly before he caught himself. He straightened his shoulders. I didn't know, Felix cut him off. You don't need to know who I am to treat people with respect. The restaurant had gone quiet. Employees exchanged glances. A few customers leaned in. Felix folded his arms. I've been watching you, listening, you talk down to customers, you belittle employees, and you think that's leadership? Todd's face reddened. I run things efficiently. This store is miserable, Felix interrupted. Look at them. He gestured toward the employees watching the exchange. They don't respect you, they fear you, there's a difference. Todd's jaw tightened. I get results. Felix's expression hardened. At what cost? Mark stepped forward then, his presence solidifying everything Felix already knew. Todd exhaled sharply. So what now? You gonna fire me on the spot? Felix didn't answer immediately. He looked around the restaurant at the employees who had been enduring this treatment for far too long. Then he turned back to Todd. I'm not making any decisions standing here, Felix said. You and I are going to have a conversation in my office, right now. Todd hesitated, but there was no room for argument. Felix glanced over at Mark. In the meantime, I want every employee here to know something. Changes are coming. You're going to be heard. A weight seemed to lift in the room. Todd swallowed hard, then nodded once. Felix turned and walked toward the door, expecting Todd to follow. This wasn't over, not yet. But it was about to be. Felix led the way through the back of the restaurant, pushing open the door to the manager's office. The space was cluttered papers stacked haphazardly on the desk, an empty fast food cup tipped over near the computer. A chair in the corner had an old uniform draped over it, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee. Todd followed, his steps slower, more hesitant now. He shut the door behind him but didn't sit. Felix didn't either. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension thickened between them, the weight of what had just happened still settling. Felix finally broke the silence. "You've got an opportunity here, Todd, to explain yourself. Take it." Todd's arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. "I run this place the way it needs to be run. If I let up, things fall apart." Felix studied him. "That's the story you're going with," Todd exhaled sharply. "You don't know what it's like dealing with these employees every day. They don't care, they don't show up on time, they take shortcuts. If I don't stay on them, nothing gets done." Felix's expression didn't change. "And the customers?" Todd's eyes flickered. "What about them?" Felix's voice stayed level. "You humiliated that woman in front of her kid. Talked to her like she was an inconvenience instead of someone paying for a meal." Todd shifted his weight. "She was holding up the line." Felix's patience thinned. "She was counting change, not robbing the place. You think that's how we built this business? By treating people like they don't matter." Todd's mouth pressed into a hard line, but he didn't answer. Felix leaned slightly forward. "You've been in charge here for a year, and in that time employees are miserable, customers are leaving, and the store looks like no one cares. That's not leadership, Todd, that's failure." Todd's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I work harder than anyone here." Felix's gaze didn't waver. "Working hard doesn't mean you're working right." Todd's breathing was heavier now, his frustration clear. "So what, you're firing me?" Felix didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang between them, forcing Todd to sit with the uncertainty. Then he spoke. "I don't fire people without giving them a chance to own up. So here's the real question, do you actually think you've done a good job here?" Todd hesitated. Felix pressed. "Forget defending yourself for a second, just answer honestly." Todd's shoulders dropped slightly. His gaze flickered to the desk, to the papers, to anything but Felix's eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, voice lower now. Felix nodded slowly. "That's the first honest thing you've said." Silence stretched again, but it wasn't as sharp this time. Felix exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Here's the deal. You've lost the right to run this place without oversight. Effective immediately, you're on probation. Mark's taking over daily operations for the next 60 days. You'll report directly to him." Todd's head snapped up. "You're demoting me." Felix's tone stayed firm. "I'm giving you a chance to prove you can be better. If you don't, you're done." Todd's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "And if I do?" Felix's voice softened slightly, but his words remained clear. "Then you earn back trust, but that's on you." Todd looked away, jaw tight again, but something in his stance had shifted. Less defiance, more uncertainty. Felix stepped back toward the door. "Mark will go over everything with you. You've got a lot to fix." Todd didn't argue this time. Felix pulled the door open and stepped out into the restaurant, where employees stole quick glances at him before returning to work. Mark stood near the counter, watching, waiting. Felix approached him. "You saw enough," Mark nodded. "More than enough." Felix glanced around. The air in the restaurant already felt different, not fixed, not yet, but lighter. He turned back to Mark. "Start making changes and talk to the staff. I want to know what they need." Mark gave a firm nod. "You got it." Felix exhaled. There was still a lot to do, but at least now, things were moving in the right direction. Felix stayed at the restaurant for the rest of the afternoon, watching as Mark started making adjustments. The employees, who had been on edge earlier, slowly began to relax. Conversations became more natural, movements less rigid. It was clear they had been operating under tension for a long time, and now that the weight was starting to lift, the change was visible. Mark pulled aside a few workers, speaking with them quietly. They nodded as he asked questions, their expressions shifting from cautious to relieved. Felix didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. Employees wanted respect. They wanted fairness. They wanted to work without fear of being berated. Todd remained in the background, his usual commanding presence subdued. He busied himself with tasks, avoiding eye contact. Felix didn't intervene. This was Todd's moment to absorb the reality of the situation, to understand that leadership wasn't about control, it was about earning trust. As the evening rush approached, Felix moved toward the front counter, watching how the team adjusted under Mark's guidance. There was already a difference. The energy felt less forced, customers received more attention, and the employees worked with more confidence. A familiar voice caught Felix's attention. He turned to see the woman from earlier, the one Todd had humiliated. She stood near the entrance, shifting her daughter on her hip, hesitating. Felix stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his tone gentle. She lifted her head, recognition flickering across her expression. There was uncertainty in her eyes, an expectation that she might be dismissed again. "I just wanted to apologize," Felix continued. "What happened earlier was unacceptable." She adjusted her grip on her daughter, studying him. "You work here?" Felix nodded. "I own the place." Her eyes widened slightly, then flickered toward the counter. "I wasn't going to come back, but my little girl wanted more fries." She forced a small smile. Felix glanced at the child, who tucked her face into her mother's shoulder, peeking out shyly. He looked back at the woman. "You should never have been treated the way you were." "That's not how we do things here, and it won't happen again." She exhaled softly, her shoulders losing some of their tension. "It's not the first time I've been talked to like that at places like this." Felix's jaw tightened. "It should be the last." She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." Felix signaled to the cashier. "Get them whatever they want, on the house." The woman hesitated. "That's not necessary." Felix met her gaze. "It is." She glanced down at her daughter, then back at him. "All right, thank you." As she stepped toward the counter, Felix turned away, his mind already moving to the next steps. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about rebuilding trust within the staff, with the customers, and within the company itself. He found Mark near the kitchen entrance, speaking with the cooks. When he noticed Felix, he stepped away. Felix didn't waste time. "I want regular check-ins at every location. No more waiting for complaints to pile up before we act." Mark nodded. "I'll set a schedule. Should we rotate managers for oversight?" "Yes, and I want employees to have direct access to report issues anonymously if needed." "If someone like Todd slipped through, others might too." Mark scratched his chin. "We'll need to restructure the leadership training." Felix's expression hardened. "Then do it." Mark studied him. "You're not just fixing this store, you're changing everything." Felix exhaled. "I have to." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Mark finally nodded. "I'll get started tonight." Felix glanced back at the dining area where the woman sat with her daughter, sharing a meal without worry. The restaurant felt different now, not perfect, but on the way to something better. He turned back to Mark. "Good, let's make sure this never happens again." Felix stayed long after the dinner rush had settled. He wanted to see how things unfolded with Todd still present, how the employees adjusted under Mark's leadership, and whether the tension in the air had truly begun to dissipate. The shift in energy was subtle but undeniable. Employees who had once kept their heads down now moved with more confidence, speaking to each other instead of just following orders in silence. The restaurant still had its usual hum of activity, but the weight that had once hung over it was lifting. He leaned against a counter near the kitchen, watching as Mark gave quiet instructions to the staff. The younger employees seemed more willing to ask questions now, no longer afraid of being snapped at for getting something wrong. That had been one of the biggest issues under Todd's management. Fear had replaced initiative. Todd remained on the floor, quieter than before, but Felix didn't miss the way his eyes scanned the restaurant. He wasn't barking orders, but his presence still carried the remnants of his old approach, rigid, uncomfortable, uncertain of where he now stood. Felix finally stepped toward him. "You're staying through closing," Felix said. Todd's expression flickered, but he nodded. He didn't argue. Felix gestured toward the dining area where a few late-night customers lingered over their meals. Watch them. Listen to how your employees talk to each other. You've been so focused on control that you forgot what makes a place like this work. Todd hesitated, shifting his weight. It's not easy keeping things in line. Felix's gaze didn't waver. No, it's not. But leadership isn't about keeping people in line, it's about making them want to be here. You've spent so much time making sure no one steps out of place that you never stopped to think if they even wanted to be in place to begin with. Todd didn't respond right away. He looked around the restaurant, his expression unreadable. Felix didn't press him. Instead, he walked back toward the kitchen where Mark was reviewing schedules. Mark glanced up. I've talked to most of them, they're relieved. A few were ready to quit. Felix nodded. We'll need to fix that. If we want them to stay, they need to believe things will actually change. Mark tapped the schedule with his pen. Todd's going to be a problem. Even if he doesn't fight the changes outright, it's going to take time for him to unlearn the way he's been running things. Felix exhaled. Then we give him time, but not too much. Mark studied him. You really think he can turn it around? Felix glanced back at Todd, who stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching the employees interact. I think he has to decide if he wants to, Felix said. The evening stretched on, and as the last customers left, Felix called the employees together. They gathered near the register, shifting slightly, waiting. Felix let the silence settle before speaking. I know this hasn't been an easy place to work. That changes now. Mark will be here regularly. If there are problems, they will be addressed. A few employees exchanged glances. One of them, a younger woman from the Fry station, hesitated before speaking. Are we actually allowed to say when something's wrong? Felix met her gaze. Not just allowed. Expected? She looked down, nodding slightly. Felix continued. We're not just fixing management, we're fixing everything. That means better training, better schedules, and making sure every single person here feels valued. A shift moved through the group, cautious but hopeful. Felix turned to Todd. You have something you want to say. Todd's jaw tightened, but after a moment he exhaled. He looked at the employees, then at Felix. I made mistakes, Todd admitted. His voice was quieter than it had been all day. I pushed too hard. I thought I was doing what needed to be done, but I see now that I wasn't. The employees listened, some skeptical, others considering his words. Felix nodded slightly. Acknowledging it is the first step, fixing it is the next. Todd swallowed hard. I'll do better. Felix didn't answer right away. He let the words settle, watching to see if Todd truly meant them. Then he nodded once. Then prove it.